the people you've had conversations or debates with in your time, with skeptics, who has been a person that has maybe surprised you or has given you a little bit to think about? What conversation stands out to one where you think that's one, how a debate should be held, and two, that's given me some things to think about?
I think my debate with Michael Shermer was like that. I wish I'd been in person with him because that's always it's better to have a conversation with somebody in person. But it was very well moderated, and he made his points, and I made my points, and back and forths. And I've got a great deal of respect for him as a communicator and a communicator of science. I think he's a crystal clear speaker and writer. Which is so helpful in a debate because you want to figure out why it is you're disagreeing. And quite often, whether it's in a formal debate or just in any kind of conversation, so much energy is wasted because you're not actually disagreeing about things. You can waste a lot of time where actually you're aimed at the same thing, but you're just sort of miscommunicating in lots of different ways. So Michael Shermer was brilliant like that. Bart Ehrman is just, a world-class scholar, and I was just, amazed that he would, spend some time to read at least some of my book and interact with some of the ideas there. So I was very honored to be in conversation with him. Probably Matt Dillahunty is the debate that most people have seen. I think it's probably the most widely viewed of the debates that I've done. And, it's interesting because he will sort of obviously bring his crowd and hundreds of millions of views on YouTube. And so he's got his own kind of audience that comes to those debates. And in one sense, there have been hundreds of thousands of views on a debate like that. In another sense, there's only two views. And those two views are Glen destroyed Matt or Matt destroyed Glen. And those sorts of debates are a bit more spectacle. They're a bit more amping up the conflict and that sort of thing. And for better and for worse. For better, a lot of people actually who wouldn't ordinarily hear my side of things are going to hear my side of things because they happen to be Matt Dillahunty fans. But also for worse, are they really hearing my side of things? And is my audience really hearing Matt's side of things? Because the conflict can sometimes be turned up to 11. And yeah, it's a trade-off, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think with a topic like this, obviously, if a debate isn't handled in good faith or handled appropriately, it can quickly descend into chaos and conflict. And when we spoke with John Lennox, we asked him a similar question, and he said two sort of polar opposite experiences he had is whenever he debated or spoke to someone like a Christopher Hitchens, he said it was always a fantastic experience. He said he never had a bad word to say about Christopher Hitchens, that it was always handled in good faith and professional. And then I suppose his sort of opposite experience was with Richard Dawkins. So what elements do you think are required to make for an effective debate around a subject like this?
You've got to understand where the other person is coming from. And so I just did a debate with Alex O'Connor that's going to come out in the new year.
Wow.
Justin Brierley moderating. And so what Justin Brierley, who's just a veteran of these kinds of conversations, did was, first of all, get us to steel man the other person's position. And I think that's just really, really wise. And it's an analogy I sometimes use. I learnt it at the pet store. I was listening in on somebody selling 2 rabbit hutches to a new purchaser, and they basically said, if you want 2 rabbits to kind of get on with one another, then you need them to be in their own hutch for 1 week side by side, and then you swap them over and put them in the opposite hutch for another week while they see the world, the way that the other rabbit has seen the world, and smell the things and inhabit the atmosphere that the other rabbit has had. And then when you let them out, they'll be best friends. And I think sort of Justin Brierley allowed us to do that with me and Alex O'Connor, and we kind of steel manned one another's positions. Steel manning is obviously the opposite of straw manning. Straw manning is you caricature the absolute worst and most stupid kind of way of understanding the other person's position, and then usually you take a flamethrower to the straw man and declare yourself to be the winner. Whereas I think, that real determination to argue with the person's position at its strongest rather than shadow box with what you wish the person had said because you're convinced that they're a moron. I think that's what will make for a much better debate.
Well, that's really interesting. So is that something you tend to do outside of debates, is sort of try and understand the opposite side or put yourself in that other rabbit hutch?
I to a fault, I try and do that, and usually my friends, I'll complain about some situation where eventually I'll get round to the fact that I believe that so and so mistreated me, but I'll spend the first sort of half of the conversation saying, but I'm sure there's a lot going on in their lives, and this time of year, aren't we all a bit tetchy? And we, I'm a youngest child in my family. I am a peacemaker. I will always try and be the cute little brother that tries to stop people arguing, actually, and tries to see things from everybody's perspective. I'm infuriating like that. I think so much of my YouTube channel as well is me sort of doing there's a conflict between A and B, but actually, if you come up to 30,000 feet, you will see that position C is the perfect optimal, like I'm infuriating like that. And even as I'm telling you what my tendency is, I'm giving off that vibe of I understand my limitations here, because and I say I do that to a fault because then there's a danger that I don't own my own position, and then I don't own the genuine misgivings that somebody has about my position because I'm always trying to see things from everybody's point of view. And what's good, I guess, about a debate is it does force me to pick a side and to defend a position. And so I actually I'm not a natural debater. I mean, I'm a pastor. I'm a Church of England minister. Church leaders are usually kind of these bundles of availability, which is these quivering bundles of availability, and we want to pastor people and kind of get to the heart of issues. Rather than be quite pugilistic, I tend to get drawn in against my will to the pugilistic thing, and I can have a go at it. I don't think I'm convincing anybody that I'm actually a pugilist, but I'm willing to have those kinds of conversations because in some ways, I think a lot of people, certainly online, their first entrance into considering Christian faith is actually they saw Richard Dawkins debate John Lennox, right? And they realized, oh, John Lennox isn't an idiot and it's not silly. There's at least one Christian in the world who is not a moron, And if Professor John Lennox is an intelligent man who's thought about these things, maybe I could, give Christianity a hearing. And so I go into these debates not because I'm a great debater, but because I'm just desperate for people to give a fair hearing for the Christian side of things, and so I'll enter into the fray.
Yeah, and I think people will be interested in this because I think debating is really an art form, and it's really hard to articulate, the points you want to make and react in real time. And especially going into a debate with someone like Alex O'Connor, who is very academic, uses thought experiments to sort of bolster his argument, can be quite confusing for people if they're not prepared. So how do you prepare for a debate like that, knowing you're going to have thought experiments thrown at you that you're not ready for? It must be quite difficult.
It's very difficult, and especially the topic that I debated Alex on was basically I wrote a book a few years ago called The Air We Breathe, and it's sort of basically popularizing the historian Tom Holland's book Dominion, where Tom Holland argues that we're far more Christian than we ever realize in the West. We tend to think that the values that we hold are just obvious, natural, secular values, and we're all good liberals, and it's just obvious that we should believe in human rights and things like that. And Tom Holland, I think, does a very good job in his book Dominion by saying, actually, there's an intellectual genealogy behind those ideas, and these have come to us through some profoundly Christian ideals. And I trace those out in my book, The Air We Breathe. And so Alex O'Connor was responding to my book, The Air We Breathe. But in a sense, because that was the topic of the debate could have been about anything, because essentially Alex's view is that, well, it would be surprising if the Bible was the source of our modern values, because have you read the Bible? The Bible is full of all these things that we find incredibly difficult and repugnant, morally speaking, nowadays. And so in a sense, the topic of the debate was kind of the whole of the Bible and pretty much all of history since, the first century. Right. and so it was very difficult to, maintain a single position and to simply defend a limited thing. And it was very straightforward for Alex to sort of to make attacks, and he did what he should do in such a debate: is try and land points from anywhere. But he literally could land points from anywhere, from the whole of the Bible, Old and New Testament, and from most of church history for the last 20 centuries. Alex definitely had the advantage in that point, because he himself did not have a position to defend.
Yeah.
And he's not a moral realist. He doesn't believe that there are objective moral values out there in the world. And so whenever I said to him, how would you have abolished the slave trade, or what arguments would you have made, like Christians made, against infanticide and things like that? And he was like, well, I don't have to. It's not my position to defend. So there was an imbalance in that way. I guess the benefit in preparing for that debate is, if the debate is about my book, well, I guess there are very, very few things that I'm a world authority on. But I guess one thing I'm a world authority on is, those 50,000 words. I studied hard for those 50,000 words. So in that sense, if I just camped out on the argument of my book, I thought I could do okay. But he's a consummate debater. He can debate 25 people all at once, as he did so brilliantly on the Jubilee channel with the surrounded debates. So yeah, my goal really was to go in and lose well, right? The idea of some kind of conquest over the intellect that is Alex O'Connor, that was never going to work. But I think trying to raise issues in the midst of a debate where he was raising other issues would, at least I hope, signal to his viewers that the Christian position is not stupid, and that there might be something, to pull on the threads off.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to put it, because I suppose winning the debate is never really the goal, right? And you put your point across there, and when you've spoken with Alex in person, because I know you've covered a lot of his content on your channel. He's becoming an increasingly popular figure in this space, and some would say a polarizing figure. But what is your honest opinion on Alex, and do you think he's an important voice to have in this space?
He's a hugely important voice, or else we wouldn't make content about him. I think, for instance, the things that he was able to draw out of Richard Dawkins, for instance, when he sat down with Dawkins. I think he sat down with Dawkins a couple of times, and then a third time in conversation with Jordan Peterson. But the sorts of things that Alex was able to get Richard Dawkins to admit, I don't think even John Lennox got Richard Dawkins to admit, right? So I think it's so helpful that Alex is a sort of a philosopher by training. That was, he did philosophy and theology as his degree. Because he approaches things from a philosophical point of view, I think he's actually able to land some really significant points in conversation with Richard Dawkins. Because Richard Dawkins is not a philosopher, and that's not really his strong suit, and he admittedly so. But the way that Alex is able to say things to Richard Dawkins, and the way Alex is able to use analogies just so beautifully, as you've already alluded to, Lewis, that there was this wonderful time when he sat down with Richard Dawkins, and he said, Richard, you seem to believe that if you add scientific law upon scientific law upon scientific law upon scientific law, you will get to the stage where we have explained the cosmos. And then Alex said, but that would be a little bit like somebody coming across the poetry of William Shakespeare and discovering that, I've discovered the rules of a sonnet, and I've discovered that it has this many beats and this many bars, and that the rhyme structure is like this, and when you put a full stop here, then the next letter is a capital, and I've discovered the laws of punctuation, I've discovered the laws of iambic pentameter, I've discovered the laws of rhyme structure. But you would be a fool if you thought that by discovering those laws, you obviated the need for William Shakespeare. Those laws do not get rid of the need for an author, do they? And he sort of communicated that just so brilliantly. to Richard Dawkins in a way that I think is superior to any Christian who has ever sat opposite Richard Dawkins. So I'm just very grateful for Alex. I think at the same time he wants to make it known that he is absolutely not a Christian, and he still has many of his anti-theistic convictions that he had when he was basically a kind of a Christopher Hitchens disciple, and he still sort of straddles those two positions. I think one of his sayings is, "I will die on this fence." Right? He says, "I'm violently agnostic about God's existence." And as long as people are aware that that is his position, he's violently agnostic, he will die on this fence, he will make a video that's very pro-Christianity and then a video that's very anti-Christianity. As long as people are aware that that is where he's sitting, I think he will expose arguments to a greater audience than certainly we can ever do on our tiny little YouTube channel. So for that reason, I'm very grateful for Alex O'Connor.
Amazing. Well, moving into a topic that you kind of touched on there in the content of your debate. When I put this out on the newsletter, as I mentioned ahead of the show, one of the topics people really want to get into was morality, values, and I suppose the question that came up more than others was, can we have real Western values without Christianity? Rule of law, concern for the vulnerable.
And I think that the argument of Tom Holland, who was just, again, he was himself popularizing the arguments of so many who, largely secular historians and political philosophers, that where we are at in the year of our Lord 2025 is to a very large degree a product of Christianization over 20 centuries. And that Christianization over 20 centuries has had such an impact on us that we don't even notice it, right? It's one of Christianity's great, one of the ways you can see the power of Christianity is the fact that we don't see it. It's the fact that we think it's obvious, natural, and universal that there are such things as human rights. And you're just like, okay, the idea that a weak person, by virtue simply of their humanity, their common humanity with the rest of us, is worthy of protection and provision, and that they have this sort of near infinite dignity that cannot be traded off against the greater good, and that they have rights that should not be trampled on. It has a very distinctive Christian genealogy to the ideas behind that value. And I guess Tom Holland, who was writing his book Dominion from a totally secular point of view, his point really is that to believe that human rights hang there in the ether waiting to be discovered, and that maybe the Christians might have discovered it, but maybe some other completely different worldview might have discovered, or maybe some other religion might have discovered it, that is to actually be quite Christian already, because you somehow then believe that woven into the moral fabric of the universe, there is such a regard for the human person, that somehow humanity exists above all the examples of human beings, because human beings in the concrete are a very mixed bag, and we don't seem to have like the highest value in the cosmos. And so the idea that, well, Christians happen to have invented human rights, but we would have gotten there anyway, even without Christianity. I think Tom Holland's point, and I would agree with him, is that is already to assume a quite Christian metaphysic. And certainly for Tom Holland, that sort of argument has been very significant for him, taking Christianity a lot more seriously. And he's basically said, well, I do believe in these things called human rights, but it's kind of a castle in the air without the Christian metaphysic underneath it. And instead of taking a leap of faith, I think he's kind of looked to where he is standing historically, and he's wanted to kind of investigate what it is that grounds his belief in values like human rights. And, he's now going to church and happy to call himself a Christian in many different senses. So, so that's the journey that he's been on. And I think a lot of other people are on that journey and waking up to that kind of thing, that Western values and Christian values, there's a lot of overlap. And that without the Christian side of things, it's not obvious that we necessarily logically, mathematically, and scientifically would have arrived at these Western values without Christianity.
I haven't heard that perspective before on the Christian metaphysics. That's interesting, and so that kind of goes towards answering the one of the major pushbacks I hear around whether there can be morality without God. In that, there's the question of whether things are good because God commands them, or does God command things because they're good? You'd assume most people would say that God commands them because they're good, which implies that there's a standard of good that exists outside of God, right? So therefore,
Right.
morality can exist without God.
Right. Oh, and this is a debate that precedes Christianity. This is the Euthyphro dilemma. So Socrates is in dialogue with Euthyphro, and Euthyphro is a very pious kind of a guy, and Socrates is alarmed by just how pious he is. And Socrates does what Socrates always does, which is ask questions to get to the bottom of it. And the famous line that has passed down to us for the last 2.5 millennia is something pious because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it is pious, right? And that second option is what you're mentioning. Do the gods, and let's recognize that as Socrates is writing, he's talking about Zeus and people, right? Do the gods just look around at the moral furniture of the universe and they recognize what goodness is, and they just say, oh yeah, that's good? At which point you don't need Zeus, right? Like there is this goodness that just kind of exists. The alternative to that is we don't know what goodness is until Zeus points it out, which sounds incredibly arbitrary and scary if you know what Zeus is like, right? Now, what's interesting is that Plato, who is writing down the dilemma between Socrates and Euthyphro, he kind of has a solution to the dilemma. And for Plato, God is goodness. Like whatever we say God is ultimately goodness, and goodness is ultimately God. And so for Plato, the concept of the good is synonymous with, is coterminous with utterly whatever he means by God. And at that stage, he as a philosopher notices that all the squabbling deities of the Greek pantheon are probably not worthy of calling truly good. But he seemed to have some hope that there is this thing called the good, which itself is impersonal, and let's just call that God. Now, so I think Plato already has a solution to the dilemma, but I think Platonists themselves can admit that it might not sound very satisfying. It doesn't sound very satisfying to me, that just God and goodness are kind of the same. But what happened is, certainly Jews around the sort of the first century, and then Christians afterwards, they found that their message was really landing with Platonists. And they were basically saying, hey, you know how you believe in some kind of God who is above the squabbling deities of the pantheon? And you know how you've got this concept for God and how you think that this really is goodness itself or himself? Well, what Christians would say is there is such a thing as God. And what the Christian can say is God is a moral community, actually. Okay. And the Christian doctrine of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is this doctrine that God is love, because God is a father loving his son in the joy of the Holy Spirit, which means that love is ultimate and God is this love. And if love is absolutely at the heart of goodness and love is ultimately at the heart of godness, I think it removes some of the arbitrariness of Plato's solution. Because you can sort of say to someone, I think love is ultimate. And I think love is ultimate in the moral realm, and I think love is ultimate in the metaphysical realm, because God is love. And at that stage, what the Christian solution to the Euthyphro dilemma is to say, well, it's in the New Testament, 1 John chapter 4, God is love. Those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. And I think the Christian is facing a dilemma that everybody faces, whether you're a Platonist, a non-Platonist, a Christian, a Jew, whatever you are faced with how do you relate morality with metaphysics, goodness with godness. Everybody's got this problem. I think the Christian solution is the least bad solution. I think the Christian solution is the most existentially satisfying solution, because we say it's actually all about love. Morality is all about love, and metaphysics is all about love, because God is love.
Yeah, I've never heard it put like that before. That's giving me a lot to think about. I really like that. And so
there's more in my if people are interested, there's like the Michael Shermer debate that I do. We kind of orbit around without naming Euthyphro. I don't think we name Euthyphro, but we're basically discussing all this stuff in the Michael Shermer debate.
Amazing. Yeah, and I'll make sure that's linked below as well as a resource. And so, which elements of the Christian tradition do you think are, say, necessary for a stable moral culture? And could any, other in principle be supplied by other traditions?
I think there are other traditions always that are in conversation with us. And what's interesting is that, like, the West, what we think of as the West, has a very particular sort of Christian history behind it that is not the totality of Christendom. And I certainly don't want to be heard as saying West is best. And what we tend to think of as sort of modern Western values has really come about, in the Western half of the church and not the Eastern half of the church, and usually the Protestant side of the Protestant Catholic divide, and usually the Anglophone side of the Protestant Catholic, of Protestantism, and certain kind of, and so just within Christendom, I think Christians need to not be so chauvinistic as to think that Western Latin Protestant Christendom is the only kind of Christendom, let alone that Western Latin Protestant Christendom is the only kind of political settlement that we can go for at all. So I don't think that West is best. I think we are always in conversation with other traditions. I think I've mentioned human rights. I think Confucianism was part of the conversation, in 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That sort of came out. I think all sorts of the sort of traditional values that people bring from non-Christian cultures into the UK, let's say, are a massive challenge, especially to the post-Christian affluent West. When I think a lot of people from non-Christian cultures, for instance, look at the way that we treat family and treat the elderly, and are appalled, and are sometimes right to be appalled by a culture that has been shaped so much by Christendom, and Christendom has invented the individual, but we've also invented individualism, and we've atomized ourselves now from one another. And I think non-Christians can totally correct us. All sorts of views can really correct. Like I've mentioned rights speak, for instance. I think the Confucianist side of things, for instance, I think in a post-Christendom frame, we elevate rights over responsibilities. And the sort of rights that we now want to claim, we don't merely want to claim rights as a shield for the vulnerable person. Quite often we use rights as a sword to make a claim against somebody else. It's my right to have X, Y, or Z. And again, people from all sorts of cultures and religions and worldviews can come and correct our highly individualized, atomized, entitled, affluent, privileged Western point of view. So I definitely think lots of people can correct us, and Jesus wants lots of other views to correct us. The most morally significant story that Jesus ever told, and the short story that has shaped the West more than any other, is probably the Good Samaritan, right? This short story in which a guy gets beaten up by the side of the road, and it's the biblical guys who don't give a damn, and they don't help the guy, and he's basically perishing by the side of the road. And first of all, the most righteous, holy-looking, biblical person walks past and passes by on the other side of the road. And so does the next most biblical, holy-looking, righteous, religious person. He's got his religion right. He's got his Bible right. And, he's a damnable fool for what he does. And then the Samaritan comes past. And you got to know about the story. The Good Samaritan, who ends up helping the guy and saving his life. He is According to everybody who's listening to Jesus, he is the wrong religion and he is the wrong nationality. He's just wrong in every sort of sense. And Jesus makes him the hero of the story. He makes him the exemplar of the kind of compassion that Jesus wants in his kingdom. And it's a guy who's from a totally different religion and nationality. I think that's brilliant. And I think our best instincts to look for the good in the Confucianist or the Hindu or whatever, our best instincts to do that are completely in line with what Jesus wants. But what I will say is that if you believe in the compassion of the Good Samaritan, I think ultimately you do need Jesus, because I think Jesus, you won't get a grounding for the compassion of the Samaritan anywhere better than in the Jesus story. Because in the Jesus story, what you have is the highest figure, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who descends to the deepest depth, right, the very pit of hell on that cross, in order to have the greatest impact on the most number of people for the longest duration. It is a story of maximal compassion, of maximal condescension. And Jesus wants you to know that Samaritans can not only believe in compassion, but can do compassion better than biblical people can do it, right? He wants you to know that. But also, I want to say that without the Jesus vision, you won't have anything like as good a foundation for compassion, because the Samaritans themselves did not have such a picture of a God who would stoop, serve, suffer, bleed, and die for us. And so what is at the core of what will lead to a culture that flourishes? I think it's got to be Jesus Christ. And I say that not in order to exclude every other religion, because Jesus Christ, wants to notice and affirm and celebrate the goodness in other religions. But I do say it because I think there is a supreme and unimprovable story of compassion in the Jesus story. And that's why Christians want to, tell the world about Jesus. And that's why Christians, want Christian values out there. I hope that's why Christians at their best want Christian values to be forwarded, because I think we have an unimprovable story of compassion that the world needs to hear.
So what would be the implications of, let's say, a hypothetical scenario in which there was the fall of Christianity? What would the implications be on society? Would we see more conflict? Would we see more civil war? What would the implications of a society without Christianity look like, do you think?
Well, we are running the experiment. So, we're kind of seeing it, happen in real time. One of the things that is happening is we have a kind of a successor ideology to the Christian story. I think the post-war liberal settlement has been to camp out on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as though it is itself a grounded metaphysic. It never was a grounded metaphysic. The preamble to the Universal Declaration is basically all about, we don't want to go back to World War II, do we? We don't want to go back to the Third Reich, do we? In the shadow of the barbarism of the first half of the 20th century, we've got a cautionary tale. We don't want to be like Hitler, right? And so since the war, I think we have tried to have an anti-Hitler vision. And historian Alec Ryrie's just come out with a book about the age of Hitler. We've kind of lived in the age of Hitler since the war, in which Hitler is the cautionary tale, and you just try to be anti-fascist, right? And I think one of our attempts to build a civilization not on a pro-Jesus vision is to build it on an anti-Hitler vision. And Hitler killed off the disabled and the weak, so we will show compassion to the disabled and the weak. And Hitler had this racialized vision of reality, and we will have an anti-racist vision of reality and all that kind of stuff, which is great. I'm very glad for anti-racism. I'm very glad for compassion and all that kind of stuff. But to build your society on what you're against is a quite different thing than to build your society on what you're for. To found yourself on what you hate is different from founding yourself on what you love. To have a pit to avoid that's called Auschwitz is different than to have a pole star that guides you. And to some degree, and Alec Ryrie has written his book called The Age of Hitler, to some degree, he's saying, well, that story is running out, and the World War II mythos is kind of running out, and Holocaust denialism is increasing, and people lining up with Hitler is increasing at the same time as people are ever more saying, oh, we just need to press the anti-Hitler button more and more and more and more. And so what we are seeing in real time as the pro-Jesus story has been eclipsed since the war, let's say, is that we've kind of got the anti-Hitler vision of sort of progressive liberal values as a successor ideology to Christianity. But then we've had the anti-woke backlash, right? Because then those on the right have kind of seen the paucity of the anti-Hitler vision, and they're sick of the self-righteousness of the progressives. And how do you explain Trump 2.0? How do you explain Trump 1.0? Very much an anti-woke movement, right? Pushing back against the excesses of the anti-Hitler vision. And so you've got two negative visions, in my view, that are sort of jostling for the heart of Western civilization. There's also Islam as a thing that's we are sort of confronted with, and so in amongst the mix, you've got Christians, and there's some sense in which the Christian church is sort of bouncing back a little bit, and people are interested in Christianity again. You've got the progressive vision, the anti-Hitler vision. You've got the anti-woke vision that's sort of a backlash against that. You've got Islam as well as another question that's in people's minds. So there's a fracture that's really going on in modern society, and I don't think Christianity is not going to sort of sweep the board of all those things and get rid of all conflict and let's just impose Christ as king and that's going to be a happily ever after. But I do think it's important to notice the part that Christianity has played to get us to here. And I think it's suggestive of a helpful role that Christianity will have moving forwards.
On politics, I wonder what your opinion is on third wayism.
So I've written on it. People can, if you sort of search third wayism and Glen Scrivener, and you'll see there's videos we've made on it. There's articles that I've made on it. It depends what people mean. So, I mean, in a UK setting, Tony Blair made third wayism kind of popular as this is what New Labour was going to do and forge a different kind of centrist politics. Mm-hmm. And when people hear about a third way vision, they kind of think of centrist dads, just boring centrist dads who won't pick a side in a culture war. And they're a little bit lefty on some issues and they're a little bit right-leaning on some issues. And, so either you get accused of being a centrist if you're into third way, or you're kind of accused of being above it all and aloof, as though the grubbiness of the culture war is beneath you, right? Whereas I think third way at its best is something that somebody like Tim Keller, who's a church pastor in the States, who planted a very successful church right in the heart of New York City, when New York City just had very few churches. There was very, very little Christian presence really in Manhattan in 1989 when Tim Keller sort of arrived there. And now vibrant Christian communities all over the place, and the church that he planted and then the churches that he planted have been very significant. And his thing was that the third way in between left and right is the original way, right? The original way has always been the Jesus way that sort of left and right have devolved from. And the left takes certain aspects of Christendom, care for the poor, the anti-racist thing, right? The left takes certain of those inheritances and the right takes certain inheritances. There is a givenness to nature, right? And we men are men and women are women. That's in the Bible too, right? And in a sense, the culture wars are kind of, we're hurling Bible verses at each other. We've just forgotten the references. And in its best sense, I think third way is trying to say, well, there is an original way of Jesus that can affirm the best of left and right, but that actually transcends the cultural binaries that are being offered to you. And I think there's never been a more important time for that kind of posture, especially when the culture is utterly tribalizing and we're now in our own silos. We don't talk to each other. I don't even hear the same news as somebody from the other side of things. It's not as though we're putting different spins on the same set of facts. We have different sets of facts. So never before has there been a greater need for saying, I see what the other side is getting right. I also think I can see what the other side is getting wrong. And I can also see that on my side, we are getting things wrong as well. And I'm not going to accept the cultural binary that's just being offered to me. And I'm going to try and follow a pole star that is above the vicissitudes of sort of left and right and the culture wars and that sort of thing. That at its best, I think, is what a third way posture is trying to attempt.
Was, say, Charlie Kirk representative of third wayism?
Cheekily, I suggested that Charlie did some third way type things, right? So, for instance, Nick Fuentes, who is very much further to the right of Charlie Kirk, Nick Fuentes and his followers, the Groypers, were trying to infiltrate Charlie Kirk's movement, Turning Points USA. And there were times when essentially Charlie Kirk, a person of the right, had to turn further to the right and say no. And he had to differentiate himself from the far right and say, actually, I think there are problems to the left of me, and I think there are problems to the right of me. And so there were definitely times when Charlie Kirk had to make those sorts of moves. And I think anybody who's actually being responsible and not simply driven by tribe, everybody needs to make those sorts of moves at some point. And so, yeah, I've pointed out in the past that Charlie Kirk has not been associated with the third way movement at all. But it's interesting that, because he acted responsibly with Nick Fuentes, he was, I think, exercising a kind of a third way muscle, even if he would not himself have given it the label third way.
That makes sense. Well, on to the back end of this conversation, as I touched on before we started recording, I wanted to ask a couple of questions that, say, members of our audience, when I mentioned you were coming on the show, really wanted me to ask as areas or questions they've been personally struggling with when it comes to religion. And the first one is one that that has always been the main question for me. So this is on the fact that if not every religion can be correct at once, let's say, yet I think it's quite clear that a lot of the time, not all of the time, someone's religion tends to be a direct result of the part of the world they're born in. So if you accept that as a truth, which I think we kind of have to, how can someone have confidence in their faith, knowing that it's quite possible or likely that if they were born on the other side of the world, that they believe something very different and hold that to be as true as the faith they have now?
Yeah. In a sense, I'm not going to be able to solve that problem because I think it is an ineradicable problem for everyone, not just religious people.
Yeah. It's
an ineradicable problem for so-called secular people. And I say so-called because of all the conversation we've already had about, the Tom Holland thesis and the idea that the secular values that we think are obvious and natural and universal have come to us through some metaphysical convictions, some theological convictions down through the years. So nobody is a neutral. So from the point of view that nobody is a neutral, and therefore somebody might well say, Glenn, you are a Christian because your mum's a Christian. I've got to say, there's a massive sense in which that's true, right? There's definitely a sense. And if I was born in 13th century Thailand, would I be the Christian that I am today? And probably not. No. But then the person who asks me that question, like, would you be the agnostic that you are if you were born in 13th century Thailand? And the answer is no, absolutely they wouldn't. So everybody's got this problem. I would notice that it's a particularly Christian problem to have. And I think we now consider it to be obvious that whatever we mean by God or the ultimate spiritual reality, that it would not have anything to do with culture or language or ethnicity. We assume that, of course, your spiritual, philosophical, moral, and religious views have nothing to do with your culture, your ethnicity. That's actually a really Christian thing to think, right? Because from the New Testament, suddenly you don't have to be Jewish in order to believe in the God of the Jews. You don't have to be a Hebrew in order to believe in Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews. And in fact, you can still be from Galatia in northern Turkey, and you don't have to join the nation of Israel to worship the God of Israel. And you can still be a Galatian, and you can still worship the God of the Hebrews. And the divorce suddenly between your ethnicity and your religion is severed in a really decisive way in the New Testament, that now we don't recognize what a radical thing that is, right? Until someone like in India, like Modi, as a prime minister, he's just like, we are from Hindustan. We are Hindus. We are a Hindu nation, right? I think at that point, Modi is speaking for the vast majority of religions around the world and down through history. The idea that your religion is separable from your nationality, your people group, is not a widespread commonplace view. It's a decidedly Christian view. So if somebody sees it as a problem that your ethnicity and your moral and spiritual views are united, they've got a quite Christian problem. But then the final thing I'll say on that is the one group on earth that is least guilty of having their ethnicity and their spiritual views united is the Christian church, right? It's phenomenal when you look at, like, where are all the Hindus? Well, largely they are in the subcontinent and in the places to which Indians have traveled, right? Where are all the Buddhists? Like really Southeast Asia, right? Where are all the Muslims? And even in Islam, as a post-Christian religion, it does have an idea of the Ummah, the brotherhood that sort of transcends nationality. And yet, in order to be part of the Ummah, you really have to be very much like a 7th century Arabian, right? And it's no coincidence that around Indonesia and North Africa into the Middle East, again, that's where, largely the concentration of Muslims is. When you ask, where are Christians from? And at that stage, it's like 25% Sub-Saharan Africa, 20% Europe, 20% North America, 20% South America, 15% like Australasia. It is hands down the most diverse sociological phenomenon the world has ever seen. So if you do value the fact that your spiritual views should not be determined by your ethnicity, I think Christianity is the most obvious option to investigate, at least.
And I appreciate you answering these questions that I've given you with, to give me 5-minute answers on topics that, you could easily spend hours and hours on. So if there is anything in these questions, maybe a video you've made before that's more in depth that you'd love to sort of add that context, please feel free as well, because I do appreciate these are the tough questions, and I've left them to last.
Great. I'll send you some links, and you can put them in the show notes if you like.
Yeah. I'd love to give everyone as much resource as possible. And so the next one then is on why God's forgiveness ends at death. So the example being, if I were, to commit some of the worst crimes possible, and version A of me was to repent on my deathbed and I will be forgiven. But then version B of me decides, I've had a good think about this. I'm gonna repent later today, but then I get hit by a bus. I'm not forgiven. So why does forgiveness end at death and, doesn't transcend past that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the best answer I've come across, and what I should say about every question like this is that don't ever think that Christians don't themselves ask these questions, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's not as though the way I became a Christian is I had 17 questions, I ticked them all off, and now I've got no doubts, and I've sort of jumped in. So it's something that I, as a Christian, kind of wrestle with, and all Christians wrestle with, and in a sense, becoming a Christian is not about having all your questions answered. It is about seeing enough in Jesus to think, I don't get all of this, but I trust you enough with the stuff that I don't get.
Yeah.
So having said that, I think on this question, the best answer to it is actually a story, and it was written by C.S. Lewis, called The Great Divorce.
Yeah.
And I would heartily recommend any of Lewis's writing. I mean, he's just a joy to read, fiction or nonfiction. This is an allegory in which there's a busload of people from hell who go up to the gates of heaven, and they basically go to kind of give heaven, a piece of their mind. What they discover is that there are these bright kind of, heavenly beings who are basically, people who are in heaven, and they are ushering the those from hell into heaven, and the gates are open. And it's like, why won't you come? Why won't you come? Why won't you come? And what Lewis does is, I think he very psychologically convincingly shows how person after person might still choose to nurse their own sense of righteousness to themselves, to not count on the bleeding charity of God, and instead to kind of clutch their sins and clutch their self-righteousness to themselves. And one by one, they all kind of get back on the bus and go back to hell. And that's not what Lewis thinks the afterlife is like. It's not what I think the afterlife is like. But what it does is, I think it makes psychologically convincing the fact that people can harden themselves into positions that they just don't get out of. And it's very much like addiction in that sense. And that if you've ever tried to intervene in somebody's life that they're making a bad choice, and then they keep on making that bad choice as though the bad choice is the solution, and they choose their problem as the solution. And if you choose your problem as a solution, it's only going to ratchet. And what he does with these guys is just kind of say, there does come a point, whether in this life or in the allegory, in the next life, there does come a point of no return, where someone would rather belong to themselves in the darkness than expose themselves to the light. And I think Lewis makes that psychologically possible. And then it just leaves you with the question. So I guess there is a point then, isn't there, where someone's choice will continue on. And I'm not able to make that sort of choice of, this person is past the point of no return. I can't do that. But I just entrust that there is somebody who is fit to make that call, and I trust him with that call. And at the end of the day, I'm not in charge of who goes up and who goes down, but I trust the person who is, because Jesus has proven himself to be the sort of judge who would put himself in the judgment seat, take the harshest judgment there has ever been, in order that no one ever need go to hell. No one need ever go to. And if he is the one that Christianity says is in charge of the last day, then I just have great hope. I'm not the one who's making the call who goes up and who goes down, but I know a guy who is. And of all the judges in the world, he's the one I would most trust to make the call. And I don't understand all the ins and outs, but I trust him to make the right call.
I love the reference to the Great Divorce there, because in all transparency, I'm not religious, as of now anyway, who knows. But when I struggle with these questions, C.S. Lewis, I have found, has been my sort of greatest answer to a lot of them, and is someone who's writing. I love the Great Divorce. I'm looking on my bookshelf here. I've got the Screw Tape Letters is next in my list to read. So I think C.S. Lewis is a fantastic sort of way of exploring these questions. So I really appreciate that answer and that recommendation there.
100%.
If we've got time, because I know we're at the top of the hour, the last question I would love to ask you is, of course, the sort of the biggest question, I suppose, that everyone struggles with. And I appreciate, you may not have the time for you to go completely in depth, but I would just love to get your perspective on where you sit with the idea of suffering, because I've spoken to many, like John Lennox, etc., who all have their own way of sitting with this question. How does Glen Scrivener sit with the idea of suffering?
Well, briefly, because it is the question. You're absolutely right, and we are all dealing with the issue all the time, whether you're a Christian or not. Like, everybody's dealing with this question all the time. And so the one major thing I want to foreground is that the problem of suffering is a problem. And I think the best way to make the problem a problem with a capital P is to say that there is something that is right. And when things go wrong, we experience them as going wrong. And that experience of the wrongness of suffering is right? The experience of the wrongness is a thread to be pulled at. And to return to C.S. Lewis, he says in The Problem of Pain, is it in The Problem of Pain or is it in Mere Christianity? He says that if there was no such thing in reality as a straight line, then there'd be no such thing as a crooked line either. Lines would just be lines, right? If there's no such thing as a straight line, you couldn't call a crooked line crooked. What do you expect? And to get rid of straight lines is not only to get rid of straight lines, it's also to get rid of crooked lines, because you can't call the crooked line crooked. It just is what it is. And to get rid of God as a solution to the problem of evil does not work, because suffering ceases to be a problem. It just is what it is. And yet that's not anyone's experience of suffering. Everyone's experience of suffering is that this is wrong, right? But if it's wrong with a capital W, then what is it that's right with a capital R? If there's evil with a capital E, then what is it that's good with a capital G? And that argument actually turned Lewis from an atheist to a theist. It didn't take him all the way to being a Christian. But I think that the Christian part of that journey is then to say there is at least a supreme story of what goodness would do when goodness sees us in the midst of evil. What does love do when love sees the beloved in trouble? Well, love says your pit will be my pit and your debts will be my debts and your bullies, I'll take them on for you. Your pain will become my pain. Your death will become my death, right? And that ultimately, again, the answer to a question is a story. And this story is of the one who is love covered over in skin, who enters in and becomes the man of suffering. He becomes a man of sorrows. He joins us at the darkest place of the valley of the shadow of death, and he experiences suffering to the nth degree, all the suffering of the world burned down onto a single spot in him, plunging it down to the hell that it deserves and rising up. And because he rises up, he can do two things. He can first say, Lewis, you're right that it's a problem. Make sure whatever answer you give to the problem of evil, that you don't dissolve the problem. It's right that it's a problem. He gives you the right to call it a problem. He also gives you the right to hope in something beyond that suffering, that the beyond the valley of deep shadow, there is cross and resurrection and a future that is beyond it. Without those two things, without the problem, without the solution, I don't think we're going to be grappling with the problem of suffering in the way that the problem demands to be grappled with. So again, it's a case of, I think the least bad answer, right? The least bad answer to this issue that all humanity must deal with, which is suffering. The least bad answer is the Jesus answer. And that's why I'm a fan, let's say.
Amazing. Well, before we let our viewers and listeners know where the best place is to find more from you, I want to end the conversation with a question I ask every single guest that comes on the show, no matter what their profession or background. I ask the very same question, and that is, right now in this moment for Glen Scrivener, what makes life worth living?
Oh man. Uh hard things that hard conversations that transform into greater understanding and hope. Yeah, the last 2 weeks have been full of really hard conversations that you go into and then you emerge from out the other side. And it's been a little bit of a cross and resurrection each time, like a little bit of a Black Friday crucified thing, followed by redemption, reconciliation, greater hope. And what makes life, the trouble is we spend our lives actually shrinking back from those conversations, and we shrink back and we shrink back and we become like the creatures in The Great Divorce who just get smaller and smaller and retreat more and more into the darkness. And there's something, I think, in my Christian faith that I mean, everybody can do this, whether you're a Christian or not, but I see it as so resonant with the Christian faith that as I embrace the excruciating nature of difficult relational conversations that end up coming out, there is the hope that out the other side, and it's utterly glorious when you come out the other side more united because you've named some stuff.
I love it. I love that answer. And so, where can everyone listening right there? They've enjoyed the hour. They wanna find more from you. They want to watch more of your videos. Maybe connect with you on social media. Where's the best place we can send everyone to right now?
If they're on YouTube, just look up Glen Scrivener Speak Life. If they're on podcasts, have a look at the Speak Life podcast.
Amazing. Well, I'll make sure those are linked in the description below. Glen, I just want to say a big thank you to you for giving me your time today. As I mentioned, as a serial fence sitter, your content has been one that I've gone back to again and again, and I thoroughly enjoy what you put out on YouTube specifically. So I want to thank you for the value you put into the world, and thank you for the conversation today.
I love the conversation. Thank you so much, Lewis.